on the tennis front, the U.S. Open is set to be one of the largest American sporting events back up in action quickly, set to begin at the end of August. But there's still some mystery around if players will be comfortable. You're seeing that in the NBA and Major League Baseball. There's so many regulations and questions about safety. If you were still playing, what would you do?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, first of all, let's put this on the table that tennis is arguably the most global sport there is as far as players coming from all over the world and having to travel all over the world. Even the golf tour, which is very global, it's essentially most of the American players play in America, most of the European players play in Europe. They don't hopscotch the world as much as tennis players do. So that's a complication for tennis because you got to deal with so many different countries and governments and where are they at in this process. Mm-hmm. But tennis as a sport is a very easy game to manage. So I think as a professional, the other thing you have to remember is that most tennis players essentially go paycheck to paycheck. I mean, they make their money by how well they do in tournaments. Of course, you hear about Nadal and Federer and Serena Williams, and they've made tons of money. They don't need, per se, the money that the tennis tour provides to keep them going. But a lot of players, even players that are pretty highly ranked, I mean, they're not making any money at all. They're not like athletes in basketball, in hockey and baseball. Baseball's having their own issues at the moment, but, that are in team sports where they're still getting a paycheck. So tennis players, I think, have to weigh that against, obviously, traveling. Most of the players coming from Europe, coming to the U.S., being quarantined, essentially, or having to stay in one hotel by JFK Airport and deal with all the parameters that are being put in place, which is completely abnormal to what they're used to. They could usually have their own entourage. They can stay in New York City. They can go out. They can basically do whatever they want. But if they're going to come and play in the U.S. Open, at least as far as the way the rules are now, mm-hmm. they're going to have to abide by a lot of rules and regulations that they're not used to.
Yeah, and that brings up another question that we see in every sport also, which is, Serena Williams saying she will participate, Nadal won't. Will this be a real U.S. Open? Because I'm nervous that all of these sports that are going to, come back in 2020 are going to have these weird asterisks next to whoever wins these things. Oh, well, it's not the same. It was a different surrounding, different environment. All the players weren't there.
Mm-hmm. Well, tennis has been through something like this before. Nothing like the pandemic, obviously, but there was a strike at Wimbledon, back in the 70s. And so that affected who won it. The Australian Open for many years was sort of an afterthought until it moved to Melbourne Park. It used to be a tournament over Christmas time, and most of the top players, a lot of them didn't even go.
Yeah.
So, of course, there will be an asterisk, I believe, just like there will be if the NBA plays. If baseball plays 80 games and the NHL just goes right to the playoffs. So I think that will happen, but I think you have to weigh that against, okay, what's the alternative? The alternative, assuming it's safe. Okay, that's number one. That has to be safe and healthy for the players, the participants, and the people involved with putting on the game, whatever sport it is. So if you assume that's the case, then it's like, well, as I've said many times, if my choice is to have a U.S. Open with no fans and all these other issues, and potentially not every player playing for the reasons that you outlined, or having no U.S. Open, I'll take the former every time.
Sure.
I'll take a U.S. Open with no fans, and because I think that's in the best interest of the game, and certainly for the majority of the players. At least you give them the decision. It's in their hands. If you come, you can play and you can make a living. It's also obviously just important for our entire country and our society, right, to get back to some semblance of normalcy, whatever that may be. Restaurants in my town are opening. They're all outdoor seating. Things are starting to open up, at least here in the New York area. So I think that this would be a step for tennis to do the same.